In the last session we talked about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which obviously is a binding instrument with ratifications by states and happily by 196 plus one that can't and plus one that doesn't. And we are now going to look at an instrument, the Guidelines for Alternative Care of Children, which is not a binding instrument, what we call soft law. And I had the great privilege and pleasure to work on both of those, the binding and the non-binding, and in between I had the pleasure also of working on the 1993 Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption, which is a private an international, no, private international law, a private international law instrument, whereas of course the convention is public. So it's been a very interesting experience to work on three different kinds of instruments in the past 30 or 40 years. What we're going to try and do in this session is approach the content of the guidelines not by describing it, but by describing how it came to be, how the guidelines themselves came to be, and also how various provisions in the guidelines actually came into existence. And so what we have is Alex, who started it all off, me, who took over a little bit in the middle, and Murillo, who spearheaded things up to the end. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to look at. So there will be substance, but it will be very much from the point of view of the why and not so much the what. With that, I'm going to hand over to Alex, who will take us through the initial stages.
Thanks, Nigel. I like how you describe it as a relay. It was a relay. It was also a trio, and much more than a trio. It was a symphony with perhaps a good quarter or a third of the people in the room here today having actually been involved. So I just wanted to take you through a little bit of why this whole thing started. Let's go back to 2003. April 2003, I turn up in UNICEF New York with a new job, working in child protection, a topic I had never worked on before. And my job was to help UNICEF country offices and to promote global advocacy to implement international standards on two subjects, on juvenile justice and on children without caregivers, was the phrase in my title at that time. So wonderful. Remember, I hadn't worked on this before. My background was in public health and monitoring and evaluation, but I've always been interested in child protection throughout my career in UNICEF. So fine, I run to the literature and I look and find all of these wonderful standards on juvenile justice and say, hey, we've got something here to work with. And then I start looking for alternative care, looking some more. There's very little out there, just the 1986 guidelines on foster care and adoption and the Hague Convention. And really nothing else other than a few wonderful articles in the CRC. So this idea started to form and we started some discussion around it. Do we need to actually try and create international standards in this area? Lucky me, the next month there was a conference in Stockholm on residential care. And that really helped to solidify it, and one of the people who helped solidify it and helped us think that through is sitting here today, Rosemary McCreary, and you'll be hearing from her later. The declaration that came out of that conference asked governments around the world to strengthen the legislative framework for alternative care. Actually, it wasn't alternative care then, it was public care, and adopt standards for public care and develop monitoring practices. So we're beginning to get, there's already some traction and some ideas. And UNICEF has a statement read by Rosemary, written by Rosemary, and with a little bit of help, for me I hope, at the conference calling for the development of international standards and guidelines to support these aims. And so we strategized and continued this process and had an internal idea in UNICEF of what we wanted to do to make it forward. Next step, call Dr. Cantwell. And so in December 2003, Nigel prepared a first concept note for the strategy. And then together with Nigel, who then started working with ISS, we started a partnership with ISS to develop some advocacy documents to help convince others of the importance of this, and really focusing on the alternative care issues at the time. So those advocacy documents, which are available out there in the ether if you'd like them, and we can easily get them to you, covered the issues of HIV, children in emergencies, and kinship care. And the fact is that in doing that and trying to start that conversation, we weren't really sure how the process was going to work. This was really quite unusual because the idea of international standards doesn't usually start from within the UN. It usually starts from governments themselves or from civil society pushing governments. So this was a kind of middle place for it to be. So how is this all going to work? We had no idea, but we figured we would find a way. And in finding that way, it was, the partnerships of course were key. And I guess you can imagine where our first stop was in terms of partnerships. I'm looking at you, Jaap. Of course it was with the CRC committee themselves. And with Jaap's guidance, we quickly made one change from standards to guidelines. And the reason for that has to do with the fact, well, a couple of things, and Jaap might be able to explain a bit later, but as I understood it at the time, the fact that the convention already existed meant that we had a kind of a harder treaty that already existed that superseded anything that might be called standards. Whereas guidelines sound like there's something in order to implement the convention. And basically Jaap's point to us was, we'll never get it past the member states if we try and call them standards. And so we switched to guidelines. And a lot of other things happened too. The committee had further discussions. There was about it internally. It led to the decision to have a day of discussion. And there was also another angle which was taken was interacting with the Council of the Commission on Human Rights as it was at the time. Let me come to the day of discussion. During that day of discussion, right after that day of discussion, the government of Brazil approached the committee, came to Jaap and said, we're interested in taking this forward. So now we had our governmental champion. And that was absolutely necessary because in the end, we all felt that it was very important that this be something which is owned by governments, that this not be something that was more general, and that this not be even a general comment. We felt that something more visible was needed, and perhaps the reasons for that is something that we can always discuss later. I'm going to stop now and pass over to Murilo because I would like, he's going to explain a bit about some of the, about how the process went, how we actually developed this together with NGOs. I forgot to mention that by 2005, the NGO committee had formed, and that's part of what has kept this going so beautifully since, and we'll be covering some of that now. But how to actually have a process where we had the NGOs and governments speaking to one another, this was really critical. So over to Murilo to explain how that worked.
Thank you very much, and good morning to each and every one of you, and especially to the little baby. Well, I think it's all about three main aspects, I would say. One, political will, and this issue was raised beforehand, to historic momentum, in the sense of feeling, a general feeling within civil society, within the UN system, and at the intergovernmental level, for the need for guidelines for alternative care, in the sense of filling in this breach within the convention, and personalities. I'm looking at Maya here, I'm looking at Alan here, whom I played a great deal of football in Geneva, founding the Internationale de Bellevue, which is up and going still now. And of course, Alexandra and my dearest friend here, Nigel, in the sense of the possibility of playing together and respecting each specificity of each one of us. Governmental representative, the consultant, an expert level, civil society, and the UN system. I would like to go back a little bit from the very beginning of this process of the engagement of Brazil. I was at the time the head of the International Relations Advisory to the Special Secretariat for Human Rights at the Presidency of Brazil, when we went on an official visit to the Committee on the Rights of the Child in Geneva in October 2005, when we took the position in demonstrating our interest not only in embarking as part of the group of friends of the guidelines, but also putting ourselves at the disposal of UNICEF and of the committee to champion this issue within the UN human rights system. At the time, it was still the Commission on Human Rights. From that point on, we engaged in a process, in a multi-stakeholder process, in which we held in Brasilia in August 2006 a very important multi-stakeholder seminar when Nigel and many of you had the opportunity of engaging with Brazilian civil society and with Brazilian government as well, and within other members of the so-called group of friends of the guidelines. And from then on, I personally was posted in Geneva as a human rights desk for the Brazilian mission to the United Nations. After that period, so from 2007 onwards, we engaged in the process of very carefully maintaining the multi-stakeholder approach of the guidelines, therefore not putting the guidelines through a pure intergovernmental process, very carefully balancing this, the nature of the discussion on the guidelines, awareness raising of the guidelines, and of course at the very end, negotiating the 172 paragraphs of the guidelines within the UN human rights system and the newly established body of the UN Human Rights Council. The main worrisome of Brazil and of the group of friends, and I'm talking about 14 countries, and I would like to name all of them in what we call a cross-regional approach. Argentina, Brazil, as I mentioned, Chile, Egypt, the Philippines, Ghana, Georgia, India, Morocco, Mexico, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, Ukraine, Uruguay, Nicaragua, Italy, Germany, and Finland engaged at the Human Rights Council in an awareness-raising process, and again, very carefully not to reopen the whole 172 paragraphs of the guidelines to an endless intergovernmental process that might take us years, 1, 2, 3, 4, even 10 years to come. There was also a doubt about the process, whether we would put the guidelines to be approved at the level of the Human Rights Council, or if we would shortcut and directly put it at the level of the UN General Assembly in New York. And the position of Brazil, together with other countries within the group of friends, was that it would be important, a very important sign of guaranteeing the empowerment of the newly established main human rights body, the Human Rights Council, to put this through the process of negotiation and approval at the Human Rights Council, and afterwards having this approved at the level of the General Assembly. Having the timing and the deadline, so to speak, to approve the guidelines at the General Assembly level by November 2009, and therefore utilizing the symbolic aspect of the anniversary of the convention during that point. And we were very happy that we achieved that. So we pushed forward the guidelines, balancing again the expert level, the civil society approach and support from the very beginning, and the support of UNICEF within the Human Rights Council through informal consultations, through a high-level panel that was held during this process when Alexandra, Nigel, and Brazilian participation played a very important role in this sense of putting the guidelines to the knowledge of the governmental representatives within the Human Rights Council, but again, not negotiating it line by line and paragraph by paragraph. And I must tell you that it was tough, because first, it was something new for a developing country to work in this multi-stakeholder mixed process, and not merely within the intergovernmental process. Second, a great deal of countries who normally utilize this very same modality of mixed negotiations were putting the process into doubt, mainly within WEOG and namely the most defensive countries in regards to rights of the child. So it was a process of convincing making and negotiating the guidelines themselves, but mainly a bridge building capacity to put together different positions, not only regarding the guidelines themselves, the very nature of the guidelines, and Nigel mentioned the non-binding nature of the guidelines, but also the possibility of putting forward a process that the intergovernmental body would, of course, have its own word and taste into the text, but would namely respect the whole historic background process within the UN system and the civil society. And at the end, by June 2009, Resolution 11/7 finally adopted the guidelines that we, again, the symbolic aspect of calling the guidelines the UN guidelines for children without parental care, in the sense, again, outreaching in terms of the nature of the guidelines, again, not being binding, but with a symbolic weight of a UN guideline, and with the important aspect of convincing governments to implement on the ground. We managed to put this forward, and by the end of the year, in November 2009, we were extremely happy to being able to approve that at the level of the General Assembly. So it's a process to be considered, and of course I'm speaking here in my personal capacity and protected by the academic environment. It was very important for Brazil and to be considered, and I'm about to launch a book on this issue by August, September this year in Brazil, to be considered a best practice in our foreign policy, in the sense of being able, of course, Brazil has a very specific position in bridge building, not only in terms of human rights, but in several areas of the international agenda. But it was the first time that we actually worked together hand in hand within the negotiation process. After every negotiation, informal meeting, we would meet, Alan, Maya, and Nigel, with other civil society representatives, analyzing together the best strategy and how to put this forward, and of course with the UNICEF. So it was something very new for a developing country as Brazil, not only to work on the basis of a bridge building, but also within the multi-stakeholder approach. And of course, I'm all ears and happy to be here. Thank you very much.
So to continue the conversation, I wanted to ask Nigel about his memories of the participation of young people in the process of developing the guidelines. How did that affect the guidelines, Nigel? Can you remind us?
Well, it's basically Alan who could respond better than I, but effectively, in contrast to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, of course we were well into the implementation phase of the Convention, and it was clearly important that we involve young people in the process. So the NGO group that was developing the drafts at the start at least was concerned to get young people involved, and it was SOS in particular that was charged with developing a small group of young people, putting together a small group of young people to sit with us when we were doing the drafting and redrafting. Of course, we made several attempts to formulate the draft guidelines at the time. And so we brought in, I think, around 5 or 6 young people who themselves had consulted with people both in their own countries and on a wider level. And they made, obviously, a very important contribution. One of the contributions was, to us, surprising, but not undesirable, but surprising from the young people themselves. And that contribution was the need that they felt very much for a provision on the use of restraints, which was not to prohibit the use of restraint in care, but was to ensure that any such use be very much a last resort, of course, but also enveloped in a number of guarantees and safeguards in relation to the well-being of and rights of the young people themselves. So that was, for us, something that we might not have dared to put in that way. We I think, as advocates, would have tended far more to say use of restraint is not allowed, and we would have expected the young people to say, yeah, you're right, go for it. They didn't, and that is just one of the issues that was that they brought up, and is now reflected in the guidelines.
Thanks. I wanted to also share a couple of other controversial issues, starting right from the very beginning. In some of the back and forth between Nigel and myself as we were first talking about what the content might look like, because we were trying to envision it. The first draft was done by the NGO coalition working with Nigel and with UNICEF. But before we even got to that draft, I have to say I had a personal insistence that we include prevention. And normally when we talk about alternative care, it's all about what happens once you're in the system. And of course that's hugely important. But I guess from what the areas of work that I was involved in at the time, a lot of work around HIV, also the work on juvenile justice, there were so many steps and so many things that could happen before a person went into care. There is so much that is in the convention itself which gives the obligation to the state to help families in their child caring role. And it was a way to kind of support the nascent area of child-sensitive social protection, of the idea that preventing separation of children from families is something that states should take serious responsibility for. So I don't think Nigel always agreed with me about that, but eventually it came around. And that was there. And I think that's quite well accepted now. Some of the other things.
Can I jump in
Oh,
on that
yeah,
one?
please.
No, not to disagree, and certainly not in public, down at the later. No, but just to say that to remain on the preventive focus, that one of the impacts of the intergovernmental process of negotiation was very much a message from governments themselves that they wanted massive emphasis on prevention in this in these guidelines. And in fact, what we had suggested as an interim title at one point was the guidelines on the appropriate use and conditions of alternative care for children. But I want to emphasise, I mean, we always think that once we get governments involved, they're going to make negative inputs, and they're going to pare things down, and they're going to take this and that out, and they won't be happy with the other. One of the reasons, of course, is it's non-binding, but the other reason was that there was a very, very firm commitment on the part of the governments to have this. To have alternative care set in the overall framework of child rights and child welfare.
I'm going to get a couple more of those controversial issues out. We only have a few more minutes.
Right.
So I'm going to spit them out, and then you go ahead and respond, both of you, to any additional, to what you remember about them. One was the issue of abandonment. And this was about whether there should be any clauses in the guidelines on the safe, anonymous abandonment of children. Anybody know whether that's there or not? It's not. I lost that battle, and I've since changed my mind on it. Liz, you may remember this discussion because a lot of it was with Nadine in your team. There was also a big issue about the legal responsibility of guardians and what it's meant by guardians, and I'm not going to get into it because it's a little bit. Let's see, Nigel may be able to explain that more simply.
Well, I'm going to explain it
No,
very.
wait. Let me get the other issues out, and then I'm going to pass it back to you.
Still, I have that nice agreement between them.
I want to make sure we get them all out, so you'll be able to respond on the others too. So another one was immigration detention. And that, in a way, it wasn't that controversial. We were absolutely clear, everyone involved in drafting the guidelines was absolutely clear that the guidelines should say that there is no way a child should be detained for crossing a border illegally. But we were certainly concerned with what Western governments were going to have to say about that, particularly the one down in London. For some reason at that time with our specific concerns, somehow it was like they never noticed it, but anyway, we got away with that. And then the other one, you won't be surprised at all, should we say that it is ever okay for children to be in residential care? And that, on that one, it became pretty clear from the young people themselves, there is a place for it. There are some other issues that I think Nigel will talk about on institutions versus residential care. But I remember that the government of India gave us a run for our money on that particular issue. Back over to you, Nigel.
No, it was also the government in London that. What was your point there? On the guardianship issue. No, the specific problem about talking about guardianship, which is a fairly common term to use, is that guardianship is used in very, very different ways throughout the world. So you have all types of guardianship. Guardianship can include something of the nature of foster care. It can be simply an almost symbolic position, and it can also be carried out as in at least in England. I don't know if it applies to Scotland as well. It can also be carried out by an authority as opposed to an individual person. So that is why you won't see guardianship as a term in the guidelines. You'll see simply legal responsibility for the child. So that's an important one. Senor.
And another controversial issue that was raised by the very end was the religious aspect. So in the guidelines we will see that and we were attempting to guarantee language that would establish the guideline for not only foster care and institutions, but also educational institutions to be working on the basis of diversity in religion. So that issue turned to be quite controversial at the very end, not only by those countries that are normally come to our minds, but I would name, for instance, Malaysia and Indonesia were countries which were very strongly positioned themselves against this point, but also the USA, also the UK, also Canada. Not only being these last three countries more defensive in regards to the process and in regards to the guidelines themselves, trying to water down the language throughout the whole 172 paragraphs, but namely the issue of religious diversity turned out to be at the very end one of the main aspects of controversy that we managed to bridge, build, and reach consensus upon in this point. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll just finish up perhaps with the question of. No, there is one thing I want to emphasise as well in the guidelines, because it's had an impact on far wider than the question of alternative care, and particularly including questions of adoption. And that is that we now have in the guidelines the first mention of the fact that poverty should never be the sole reason for removing a child from his or her family. And that clearly is a principle that has wide implications in the field of child protection, and we're very pleased that we managed to get that one into the guidelines. Of course, the issue of residential care is that, as I was saying yesterday, the use of words. So often residential care is referred to quite simply as institutionalisation, which is clearly totally inappropriate. And the young people, as Alex said, the young people themselves were adamant that not every young person wants to go into family-based alternative care if alternative care is needed. So that young people are saying appropriate residential care can be the right thing for some young people at certain points, and is therefore absolutely to be included in the guidelines.
I think we're now on to our questions, but I want to suggest, and you were going to read them, I think, Nigel, so I'll hand it back to you to do that. But I think I want to suggest that in addition to the critical questions, we probably raised some issues here. You may have some other queries as to how this all happened and what some of the other issues were. So I think people should also feel free to ask us that. But we're keen to hand it back over to you. So Nigel, for the questions.
Yeah, and I'd also very much like, I don't know whether you know the guidelines well or whatever, you do. I'd really appreciate, I think we'd appreciate your reactions to them if you have some. Not forcing you, but inviting you. Okay?
Nigel, can I suggest how we go forward from here before the question? Can we hold off just for a moment?
What?
Hold on for 1 second. I want us to hear that question, but just before we do, what I'd like to do is ask, for those who have been involved in the development of the guidelines themselves, did anyone want to add anything very brief to the story that's just been told, given that Mia is here, Niap is here, and others are here?
The question, why guidelines and why not a general comment?
Yes,
I remember discussions with some permanent representatives in Geneva, particularly the one from the UK, because we wanted guidelines like on deprivation of liberty, the standards, a document with the weight of the General Assembly's approval. And they said, well, why don't you? That's too complicated, that's too difficult. General comments is much easier. So just as an explanation for the long trip that was made. to get to the guidelines, and let me remind you of the fact that they have not been approved by the General Assembly. They have been welcomed by the General Assembly, which also is an indication of the sensitivity of the whole issue.
Hi, I'm Alison Sutton, Save the Children. I was in the UNICEF office in Brazil at the time, and I just wanted to comment that as well as Brazil's role in sort of fostering the process and the expert consultation that took place in 2006, what was really important was Brazil's own internal process at that time was about developing its own national plan for the right to family and community life. Which followed, the separation, and therefore the substantive contributions that Brazil made as a country were very important in strengthening the whole prevention element. The fact that poverty is never a reason for separation was already in Brazilian legislation, but you had a real big push, and in that expert consultation there was wording all about the whole issue of all the measures that the state could take to prevent separation. So that was very interesting to see the sort of mirroring of this international process with a very rich national process going on. And obviously very grounded in the convention because of Brazil's history in that regard.
Yeah, it's just Nigel mentioned the positive influence that certain states had in the drafting, and I wanted to just flag that we had a problem that came or was presented to us by New Zealand, by Australia and America and Canada. And in the earlier drafts, informal care in kinship or whatever form it might take was woven in with the general conditions of care. And the New Zealanders came, and I remember a phone call at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night from Nigel. The New Zealanders are right. If we go with this, they had said to Nigel, if we go with this, you will take us back into breaking down Maori households, just because people are being looked after by their aunts, because we were formalising the informal. So when you now read the guidelines, of course, informal care is an empowering agenda, not registering it as such, but encouraging informal caregivers to make themselves known in order to access benefits and support. That all emerged solely out of this intervention by New Zealand. So yeah, there was lots of positive influence from state intervention.
About one of the goals of the guidelines, like keeping the children with the family or even return them to the biological family when the case, gives you the opportunity. Sometimes the main problem is, the goal is fantastic, but the main problem is a person who is, let's say, reviewing the case of the file or the file of the child. So it's like sometimes people are judgmental about stuff. So it's like, one of the points I see in the goals, I didn't read any more in the guidelines because it's like I just made a brief reading, but this is like one excellent goal, but we have to keep an eye on who is checking this file.
Thank you.
Actually, it's not really to talk about the guidelines. I had one question because you, Madam, you talked about immigration a little bit, and that was something I wanted to tell because the biggest problem I think nowadays is isolated foreign minors, and I haven't heard anything about it. And I'm the only black person in this assembly, which is also something striking that you actually need to talk about, I think, sometimes. And I was I'm sorry, but I need to say it. And I know that you had, you worked on it maybe a month ago, you worked on the CRC, a thematic on immigration. And I wanted to know what were the results of it. What are you going to do with the CRC guidelines and that question of immigration? Do you have any development?
Splendid question, and we take your challenge entirely. Is that something you want to comment on, or is there more from Berlin?
Just a little comment on following up the script that we worked upon here, why Brazil engaged itself in this process. And of course, it has a great deal to do with the political background and the fact that Brazil is among the very first countries that internalized the convention through the so-called ECA, the Statute of the Child and the Adolescent, and mainly it had an impact further than the set of rights themselves of the child, but the establishment of what we call in Brazil the Conselho Tutelar, which is the root based at the municipal and state or provincial level councils to protect and to guide children and adolescents with full participation of civil society. That it played a great deal of importance in Brazil during the re-democratization process from 1990 when we adopted the convention and when we approved the statute in establishing bodies through which root-based civil society representatives and social movements would be able to participate and to recommend policies to the government. So in a way, it came from that process on up to 2005 and 2006, when Brazil had a strong political background with full participation of civil society, pushing forward our official positions up to the way to Geneva and to New York. And it has, of course, a great deal to do with this basis of participation and participatory bodies that were created due to the adoption of the convention back in the 90s.
Do you want to pick up over then?
We'll pick it up now next.
Okay, next session we're going to pick up on immigration and child progress. That's okay. Thank you. And now I'm going to give you this microphone back. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Would you like my mic?
It's very nice of you to return it, yeah. Okay, burning question. Well, burning question. No, a fairly fundamental question. Alex at the start mentioned the fact that in the field of juvenile justice we have a whole plethora of standards, of non-binding standards, as well as, of course, the longest article in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 40, which is devoted to juvenile justice. So we have a massive amount of standards, norms to underpin the work we do in the juvenile justice sphere. And we have now the guidelines. And what we were wondering is whether you see any differences in the progress that has been made in relation to juvenile justice and alternative care, recognizing that the juvenile justice standards are there since the 80s, and that the guidelines have been around now for 8 years. Do you see any differences in the progress made? And if there are such differences, do you see any reason, or do you see particular reasons why the rate of progress has been different in those two spheres?
And as you're thinking about the answer, I realized Fuzi was left unanswered.
Well,
Okay, good.
But you can answer that.
No, I can't other than to say that the guidelines specifically say that when a child crosses a border, either accompanied or unaccompanied, they should, well, even if they're accompanied, I can't remember exactly what it says about accompanied, but in no case should a child be held in a detention situation for having crossed a border. But what you were asking about is something that's happening right now, and I have less information on it, but others will talk about it later.
And we'll keep the suspense going on that one. And so the question is differences in progress made between juvenile justice and alternative care. If so, why? And comment on the pace, or if you have any thoughts. I'm going to suggest that anyone who may not be familiar with the juvenile justice guidelines, could we reframe that question to be thinking about the implementation of the guidelines in terms of the pace and what can be contributed to speed up that pace and make sure that it's done appropriately, and just to make sure this is an inclusive discussion for people. Would that be acceptable to your panel? Yeah? Good, I saw a nod, I'll take it. Good, so can I ask you, again, we'll start with the way we did it last time, which is that you find a couple of people around you, have a quick conversation about some of those key areas, what are the differences made in progress, and what can we learn about that? We've just been talking for the last session about a process that has been at a very high level, and many of us get really excited about this, and I'll confess that that actually is a very nerdy thing, if I may just respectfully love our panel and our audience. Really, there's an unsaid assumption that I should have said at the very beginning, which is this process is understood to be a very powerful process to make change for children. And so I think we all might understand that we mean that, but our talk about this process is essential for us to understand how this process can be used and how we can learn about that process in order to make the difference international to national to the day-to-day lives of children and young people. And I'm just wanting to come back to that link to make sure we're all understanding that we're all coming from the same page on that. So we're going to now look to the question that was a critical question about the pace of development and the way in which the guidelines have been developed, and in contrast, if you can, to the juvenile justice guidelines, and any comments about that. And I wonder, as a starting point, can I open that up to you, and then we'll come back to the panel for final comments? I'm not being precise.
Wasn't really the question.
Differences in progress made between juvenile justice and alternative care. Are there differences? If so, why? And comment. And I'm just mindful that we want to open it up to people who might not know very much about the juvenile justice process. Yeah. Is that okay?
It's not about the process, it's about the actual progress in implementing the guidelines on juvenile justice and implementing those on alternative care. That was the clarification.
Good. Okay, so can I get I see Archis in the back. I'm dying to make sure he gets the first comment, so thank you.
So what I'm going to say is, I haven't drowned it well up in my mind, so bear with me. But thinking about situation in one country, and I'm sure different countries around the world, one of the reasons maybe for why juvenile detention system is somewhat lagging behind is that in many cases children from care institutions are being sent to juvenile detention centers, or they're being sent to mental health institutions, and by that they the care system is expelling so-called undesirable children. And after that we can say, yes, care institutions are becoming better and better, these children are getting better and better, the care is getting better and better. But that's because those who need this care the most just simply aren't there. And the other systems maybe are not progressing as fast because their role is not, they are not seen as representative, but more as a reservoir for all these other children who we simply, not we, but in the States maybe in general just push out of the public view. So I hope I didn't.
That's a very powerful point. Thank you, Archis.
Tom Bailey, former Children's Commissioner of Scotland. I'm not sure I'm competent to answer the question as it's asked, because in Scotland there have been progress made in both juvenile justice and alternatives to care, and it's difficult to know whether that's down to UN standards or guidance. And I'm reminded, Marilla, you made a really powerful point about the process of change that that you've just witnessed, which was about the political will. It was about the negotiations and representations, and it was about the personalities involved. And actually, that's not just the UN level, that's at country level as well. So I suspect that those three factors will be at play in each jurisdiction. And if I just make an observation, whilst I say that there's been progress made in alternative care in Scotland, we have got more column inches and reports and guidance and government exhortations to do better, that you would expect us to have world-class services on the basis of the amount of paperwork that we produce. So for me, it comes down to those three things about political will, the power of the negotiation, and actually the power of the personalities that are able to influence change.
Thank you, Tim.
Hello, I'm Hugh Salmon from Family for Every Child, which is a global alliance of local civil society organisations working to improve children's care. I think for me, I'm not such an expert on juvenile justice, but I think I would imagine the difference for the different speed of implementation has been the wider vested interests in the care sector than in the juvenile justice sector, which tends to be a slightly narrower group of providers, particularly of detention. You know, detention tends to be under a single line ministry, often connected to law enforcement, and therefore doesn't involve such a wide range of actors. We've talked about faith-based, we've talked about many people who provide boarding schools, and obviously that I'm sure that there's discussion about boarding schools in this, do they count as alternative care or not? Sometimes they are used as such, but they're primarily for education. But for me, in the provision of residential care in particular, there are many vested interests. There are the employees of those institutions, the donors for those institutions who very much are hooked to continuing to give because they feel that's the best way for their money having an impact on children, where they're more concerned about where the money would go if it went to families and communities. Then there is a whole issue of adoption and adopters and the sort of the pipeline to adoption that are often connected to care providers, sometimes in corrupt ways, other ways in a more, shall we say, business-oriented way, but often not in a child-centered way. And then finally, the whole issue about faith-based organizations. And I just recognize and I understand how difficult it must have been, that whole discussion about diversity of faiths and backgrounds to get agreement on things. So I imagine that it was probably easier to agree on what to condemn when looking at juvenile justice, because you had fewer people to convince and there was a more single line of conviction. But actually then implementing that may have been, and as we heard from others, I think there's probably things that are being signed up to with relation to juvenile justice which are very far from being implemented. But you could get people to agree on them being bad, but whether they actually do those things is an entirely different matter. Whereas getting to people to agree on anything in relation to alternative care must have been massively difficult. That's
It's a very helpful answers. Thank you.
I just want to follow on from what Jaap said and what Art said and also what Hugh said. In my experience, I don't know if it's actually the result of guidelines or not. But in my personal experience working around local governments, I would say that it's actually been easier to have the conversation about juvenile justice because it's about the things that Art just mentioned. It's about state security. It's about building on a judicial system that already exists. And it's about protecting society rather than us understanding the need to protect children. Whereas building agreement and alliance on alternative care, I wouldn't say it's been a struggle everywhere I've been, but it has been very difficult. However, I will say, I remember I was Chief of Child Protection for UNICEF in the Jerusalem office the day the guidelines were published, and I remember having a little dance around my office, thinking, at last I've got something in my hand that I can now go to my partners with. So I think there has been a huge movement since the guidelines were produced. But I think if I had to say which was easier to work on with governments, it's most definitely been the juvenile justice issues, probably not for the right reasons.
Yeah, I suppose one of the issues for me is some of the contradictions. In Scotland, because of the Kilgrandon report going back to the 1960s, the distinction between, to an extent, youth justice, children who offend and children in need was broken down. And so the two systems overlap very much. And yet, on the other hand, we've only just raised the age of criminal responsibility in this country from 8, or at least to announce that they'll look into it, from 8 to 12, and even 12's not particularly advanced in terms of other countries. So you can see, so even within one country you get these contradictions in terms of children's rights, and I think that highlights the complexity of the systems that we're working with.
This isn't a comment on the distinction between juvenile justice and alternative care. It's about the gap between the alternative care guidelines and the practice. And in England at the present time, there are several hundred children, mainly with learning difficulties, mainly with autism, mainly exhibiting challenging behaviour. who are inappropriately placed, largely in National Health Service psychiatric facilities. When I say inappropriately placed, what I mean is that they're there because that's the only institution that is capable of actually coping with them, not because it's the one that will best meet their needs. And certainly, paragraph, I think, 21 of the alternative guidelines are not met in the case of those young people. And one last sentence. Often, people then sort of say, well, it's about resources. I actually think there's enough money in the various systems. The problem is that it's locked behind each individual system's doors, and what is lacking is a process whereby the resources actually follow the needs of the child rather than the respective needs of the child for education, health, and other measures. Just do not come together to meet those needs. So that's one, I think, gap for a relatively small number of children, but very often children and young people with the greatest need. Thank you.
I would say that concerning the progress made in the field of juvenile justice, I still feel that even though the guidelines and the standards exist for more than 30 years, even more than that, we still have a lot of progress to make, and I still feel that we haven't been so successful in implementing this principle in various fields. Concerning the guidelines on alternative care, which are more recent, I think that it will still take a lot of time before they will really be taken into consideration seriously. So it's of course difficult to compare the progress made on one side and another, and there are obviously links between both. My fear is that we often oppose on the one hand the situation of children in conflict with the law, and these are ugly children in need of a very strong response from the state. And on the other hand, poor little children in need of care and protection, and that have to be protected even against the family, their own family. And so if we keep this kind of distinction, and if we don't see that very often many of those children are the same, and one day they will commit an offense, and the other day they will be in need of protection, I think that we are on the wrong path. And so we should have probably a broader view on the situation and try to avoid opposing the ones and the other. Last comment is that, of course, the progress are not always forward. And if we look at juvenile justice, we have done sometimes some progress, but there are so many examples where we are going backwards. And so this is probably the most worrying thing. It won't always go in the right direction.
I'd like to offer the panel any final comments before we move to the last 10 minutes and then we'll stop for lunch. Do you have any final thoughts or comments for? Yeah, they're going to be speaking as well. Do you have any final comments for this piece as well?
I just wanted to, I really appreciated the depth of thought of the responses around the room. I'm taking copious notes and learning a lot. And I want to just comment on a few things. I found the mental health comments that came up both from Arcturus and from Roger really resonant and important in terms of where to look next. I think that these are things that we need, links that we need to be making that are perhaps less strong, but the guidelines can be used perhaps to help argue those issues. And of course, the guidelines themselves are only a part. I was intrigued by Hugh's comment about how juvenile justice is wider, is narrower than alternative care, and perhaps that makes it more. You can kind of handle it all at once. And I just wanted to relate an experience that we had during this same time trying to develop indicators for juvenile justice and for formal care. We were using the phrase formal care at the time. And I think both sets of indicators are used by the Committee on the Rights of the Child now, perhaps the Justice ones more. but it was really difficult to do the measurement ones for juvenile justice. And the reason was because although it seems like it's one system, you have the courts, you have the prisons, you have the Ministry of Justice, you have the police. And tracking any one child through all of those is incredibly tough. And so having indicators that work for that were really tough. And then just a final point is that I absolutely take Benoit's point that the speed is going to be very different because the guidelines are 30 years younger than the juvenile justice standards. But what it seems like to me, as somebody who was involved in this process all the way almost until the end, I wasn't there anymore at the very end, but close to, and then suddenly as an outsider, that the big difference was the NGO support and buy-in. And academic support, that this was kept alive. The guidelines became not just guidelines, they weren't just this document, but something that quickly turned into implementation handbooks, into how can we make this happen through our own organizations, in a way that I think was much more the case than with juvenile justice, which happened much earlier before those same kinds of institutions existed, with the exception of probably DCI and maybe PRI trying to push the juvenile justice standards.
Thanks, Alice.
Yeah, I think I'll pass on this because you said basically everything in a very long speech. We did formulate it as an open question, right? Do you see differences in progress? But we definitely had, or I definitely had, the impression that you were going to say, oh yes, there's been such a lot of progress in the alternative care sphere, but we've had a lot of problems in the juvenile justice sphere. It didn't come back that way, and it's for very, very good reasons that you've explained, and I think that is that's a lesson learned for me and for you. Yeah.
Oh, just very quickly, and especially on the issue that was mentioned about the need of a synergy between political will, personal engagement, and historic momentum, not only at the international level, but also at the national and root-based level. I totally agree with you. I would reiterate the importance of the internalization of the convention in Brazil and in several countries, enabling root-based participation in the construction of strong social and political movements, which went far beyond the issue of the rights of the child in a much broader aspect. And I firmly believe that we might be seeing this coming back. Just a small, tiny little advertisement, so to speak. We have just launched, and I participated in a book on the issue of governance and democracy, both participatory and representative democracy by the University of São Paulo, in which in my article I established this link between the famous concept and book by Freud, the malaise in civilization, saying that we are in several countries, in Europe, in the Americas, everywhere, facing what I'm calling a malaise in democracy. So in a way, a lack of confidence towards politics and towards social service, and to a lack of confidence from the youth, by the youth, and a lack of confidence of the general and average citizen in regards to the possibility of truly making change through democratic bodies and through politics. And of course, we all agree the dangers behind this issue. And I believe that, again, the flag of rights of the child and the social movements in this aspect might be a very important instrument for us to regain trust, for us to regain possibilities of fully participating in changing things on the ground. Of course, it's extremely important to see how the guidelines from the international level, how they are being implemented on the ground. And of course, there might be some gaps and some difficulties, which I think it's something normal in the sense that it's also a political process within every country and taking into account its specificity, cultural, religious, political, economic, and civil and social specificities. But I firmly believe that it's a very important instrument that might enable social movements and civil society, the academic, NGO representatives and government representatives to push this forward in this sense. One concept that I would like to flag is what we've been calling, positive and creative pressure from civil society and social movements facing challenges and putting pressure in a constructive and positive way on government representatives. And also the other concept, the so-called creative tension within this relation between civil society, government representatives, and the academics. And I firmly believe that the guidelines are a very interesting result of this positive pressure and of this creative tension that we took some years in Geneva together with my colleagues here with a very positive and concrete result.
Thank you very much. Chrissy and Mia, we just have a short input from them with a focus on implementation now of the guidelines. And you won't have a question at the end, you'll just have some lunch when we're done. Over to you.
So we have 4 minutes.
You can take a bit longer.
Okay, we're very conscious that it's almost lunchtime. So Mia and I are going to do a double act. And we're actually moving forward a little bit because one of the things that I think you all know is it's absolutely wonderful to have the convention. It's amazing then to translate the convention into the guidelines. But actually when we talk to people around the world, they say, how? And so ultimately that's what we want to see. We want to see a change on the front line, and we actually want to see, to support practitioners, carers, everyone responsible for implementing the guidelines. So we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of things that have been developed, mostly I have to say on the instigation of this lady sitting next to me who's been a great mover and shaker to get these things happening. But we're going to talk a little bit about some practical tools that have been developed since the guidelines were first issued, and we'll be very brief.
Yeah, so basically what we want to do is build bridges from the last, where did we get from the guidelines, and the 167 paragraphs that were finally accepted at the UN General Assembly. And what we wanted to do, because we were working with the Geneva Working Group on Alternative Care, working with the New York Working Group on Alternative Care, was to keep that momentum going and to keep that multi-stakeholder participation. The governments, the NGOs, the UN agencies, UNICEF headquarters were just brilliant. They were really visionary because even before the guidelines were accepted in 2008, in anticipation, they said, what are we going to do next? As soon as the guidelines are here, what do you want to do? And so with the 30 organisations that we were working with, we spoke to our national officers and things like that. We came up with 2 projects. And those 2 projects were really, one was on implementation, an implementation handbook on how to help people put into practice, bring down to the grassroots level, the 167 paragraphs, but also training. But these international global initiatives were not on their own because there are many, many others. And it's really exciting to see everybody, all these international organisations really holding hands, and it's quite unique and very different, I think, to juvenile justice that we were just saying, is because everybody has been moving in the same direction. So just to name a few of those global initiatives and then to focus on the 2 that we have been working on, and Celsus in particular with Nigel has been working on. We've got the deinstitutionalisation campaigns in both Eastern Europe and in Latin America for children between 0 and 3, spearheaded by UNICEF and also RELAF in Latin America. We have the Childonomics project by Eurochild, and that's really trying to follow investing in children in alternative care and trying to give a data and economic reasoning to invest in children, even though it's very expensive now. In 10 years, 20 years, you will see that the costs really were well worth it. Then we have the funding streams project being led by a number of foundations, and that's very exciting as well because they're watching how money enters into a country, in particular into residential care from foundations, but also from individuals, like sponsoring a child in an institution, or from volunteers. So that work's going on. We've got the Better Volunteering Campaign, and that a lot of this work is being spearheaded by Better Care Network and that network of international organisations. And so amongst these international initiatives, we have this moving forward. And that was what we said was in 2008, UNICEF headquarters wrote to us and said, what are we going to do? And we said, well, we think an implementation handbook would be very good. We had to wait till the guidelines were actually accepted, and in 2010, Peter, who is not here, he's gone, but anyway, he was here and he said, I have budget for that now. And I thought he was not here, but anyway, and so with him we worked with Save the Children, UNICEF, SOS Children's Villages, Family for Every Child who are here, also ATD Fourth World, and really a whole heap of international organisations working to develop this tool. And I think for us, this tool is a signature publication of Nigel because he was one of the main authors. And if we can say a signature publication of him is because it really shows his thinking in terms of what we've been seeing the last few days. He's dying here, but it's true. And Ian and Susan here as well, and Jennifer, who are also key authors, and Neil. Oh, yeah, I've never met him. But yes. And I think this publication was the first time we could consolidate the thinking around alternative care in a practical tool. So it has things like the policy questions that Susan came up with. We have the promising practices that were really vetted academic-wise by Neil and Ian. And then the critical thinking part with Nigel setting the benchmark. Like they spent, I remember, at least a month going backwards and forwards on 2 pages of this Moving Forward handbook on what really is best interest. How do we determine best interest in alternative care? And also the importance of the use of words that we've been coming up with as well. Moving away from using best practice to promising practice. Because what the authors came up with was the idea that how do we know what best practice is and who are we to say that that's best practice? What we know now is very good for today. Is that really going to be good in 2 years' time, in 5 years' time? So they came up and were very careful with the wording to change it to promising practices. And I think, yes, and then following on from this international tool, we have the Tracking Progress tool. And that Tracking Progress tool, again, used the same stakeholders. So everybody kept holding hands. This time it was led by Better Care Network and Save the Children, but the same core group. And that's very rare that everybody keeps holding hands in the NGO, UN level, and it's worked. And the Tracking Progress tool should be launched in the next few months. The Tracking Progress tool is basically to identify where there are gaps in your system in terms of collecting data and where you should be improving your data collection to help you do better policy making. And then from there, we've moved to the second need that we already identified in 2008 is a training tool. And that training tool was largely developed again by Celsus with the same agencies, Save the Children, UNICEF, SOS, everybody again still holding hands. So it's been almost a decade, even more, that we're all holding hands. And now Chris is going to talk about the...
I'm going to do an advert actually. But I also want to say we kept holding hands because of me, very much so, being in the middle of it all. So I want to thank her for that, really. Years of keeping us all happy, taking phone calls at midnight. Sorry, I just have to close this down. Okay, so again, as Celsus, we were absolutely delighted to be approached and asked if we would look at an implementation tool. And so we have produced something called a massive open online learning course. and it's a plug because it's going to be running 4 more times, but we've just actually finished the first run. It's called Getting Care Right for All Children, implementing the UN guidelines for the alternative care of children. We've just had 5,043, I think, learners join us from 100 countries around the world. And they've just completed, as we say, we just finished the last one of it last week, so it's divided into 6 weeks. And we've made it very practical. What do the guidelines and what does the handbook actually say to you as a frontline practitioner? What does it mean? And think about how you're doing your work or your responsibility as a carer. So each week basically has about 20 steps that people can undertake in their own time. Once they've signed up, they can do it at their own pace. It's about 2 hours online learning a week, extra work if they want to do it with some additional reading. And we have a whole load of videos of experts from all around the world who contributed, who gave very practical examples of what using Moving Forward and implementing the guidelines meant, including some people like sitting in this room again. But most importantly, and this is something Mia really wanted me to stress, was, was we asked young people, young adults and children what they wanted to see in the MOOC and what was important to them. So we asked a question of children all around the world, and I particularly want to thank Save the Children for helping us, and SOS Children's Villages International for gathering this film for us. But we asked them this question: what would you like care workers to consider when they support children and young people in care? And I'm just going to
Ყველა მას სწავლობს ურჩევ, რომ ბავშვთან ხდეს ერთნაირი მიდგომა და არ განსხვავონ ერთმანეთისგან.
I believe that children want to live with their families.
Yang kelima, juga tidak mau ada kekerasan terhadap anak-anaknya. Yang keenam, mendidik dengan kasih sayang. Terima kasih.
So that was one thing that we felt important at the beginning of every week of the course. We open it with the voices of young children, young adults and young people. And the other thing that I want to show that was also most important to us is we started a conversation through the comments that people could post, so people could talk to each other around the world. So people from Ecuador were talking to people in Nigeria, and people from Scotland were talking to people in Vietnam and Cambodia. And so the most important thing for us is we have been able to instigate shared learning and integrated learning. So it's not necessarily what's come off the page, but it's people learning from each other and starting those really interesting conversations, which for me has been one of the most fascinating things. And I've been the fortunate person to read every one of the comments that's been posted over the 6 weeks. And we now have an incredible wealth of information and understanding from people who are taking responsibility to implement the guidelines and the Moving Forward Handbook, and what they're challenging, what they're doing, how they're also enjoying the guidelines, because it's really supporting in their work. And just to finish on saying that I think one of the most grateful things for me is the comments that come at the end, and people actually saying, well, you know, I've got a meeting tomorrow, and I'm going to go in tomorrow and do that meeting differently, was one of the comments. And another comment was, well, I'm a social worker, and we have this mini-series. We wrote this little mini-series of a family that runs through with some sort of really heartbreaking sort of cliffhangers to bring you back next week. And one of the comments was, I'm a social worker, and what I'm going to do tomorrow is very different, because now I've seen the social worker in the film. I know I don't want to be that social worker, I want to be another social worker. So those sort of comments have been really rewarding. And just to say one more thing that we're going to be going forward.
And also, this will answer your question in terms of children on the move, because the guidelines do have the 2 parts to address that. What we'd like to do is to develop a massive open online course for children on the move, and also for workers to ensure that they don't have this discriminatory approach, which is this social worker with their own judgment values when they decide what is best for the child without including what the child really wants. We'd like to work on that MOOC. We'd also like to develop in the future other MOOCs with the same organisations, one on children with disabilities, because we know that that is a group that's overrepresented. And then of course there are a million other ones, and I guess the big lesson for us working in this field is to keep dreaming big, even if the money isn't there. The money will eventually come, but the need is so great that we have to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.